go through this story, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 37 today. We're trying to get this idea of the upper story and the lower story. And I don't know if I've clarified that, but just get into this a little bit again. God has an overarching plan of what He's doing. God, all through the scripture, will be unfolding His will, His desire, His plan, what He's trying to do to redeem mankind. He created us to have a relationship with us. We rebelled against that. And all through the scripture, He's trying to bring us back. And that's kind of that upper story thing. The stuff that happens to us, the little things that go on, is the lower story stuff. And so the curse of the serpent back in the first story, that sounded kind of a lower story, but in it God alluded to the Messiah, the one who would come and crush the head of the serpent. That's upper story kind of things. Or the episode of testing Abraham's faith by sacrificing his son. Same kind of lower story thing, but it was a foreshadowing of God sacrificing His son on the cross of Calvary on Mount Moriah. So that's an upper story kind of thing that He brings into that. We play this out in our lives every day, the things that happen to us. Just in my own life, most of you heard this before, but I wanted to be an engineer. And so you're ready for school. 2 weeks before school started, we went out and got enrolled and put a deposit on an apartment where I was going to live. And I was going to go to the Colorado School of Mines. It's kind of like Rose-Hulman in Indiana. That was out in Colorado. And so on the way home, my parents and I were discussing finances. And we got to say, my first year's paid for, all the scholarships and stuff, but what happens in year 2? Can we really afford this? And so we decided maybe we should go ahead and go to Kansas State University. Well, my mother and my aunt and 2 of my sisters went to Manhattan Christian College, which is also in Manhattan, Kansas, with Kansas State University. They have a dual degree program. You do a degree from both schools. I've been there a few times. I liked the school. I wanted to live in the dorm there. I wanted to play basketball for them. So I enrolled at Manhattan Christian College and Kansas State University. When I used up my eligibility to play ball and was done playing, I only had 6 hours left in order to get a degree from Bible college. Well, I'm not close. I might as well go ahead and get it. I'm never going to use it, but I might as well go ahead and get it. That's all lower story stuff. Here's what's up here. Here's what's going on in the upper story. God had a plan for my life, and He didn't seem to care what I intended. If I hadn't gone to MCC, if I had been to school out in Colorado, I'm not sure I'd held on to my faith, because at that time it wasn't real strong. If I hadn't gone to Bible college, I certainly wouldn't have met Davina. And there would have been no Delaney, no David. I would never have been asked to be an associate minister, which then gave me the opportunity to become a preaching minister. So had I followed my plan, I would be an engineer out in Colorado somewhere and may or may not care about who God is. But God had a bigger plan. He had an upper story. And somehow here we are. When we study the Bible, we need to understand there is this upper story and this lower story. And when we read the stories of the lower story, keep in mind God has a big plan at work. And my hope is that we'll make the transition from the story that we're reading to the story of our lives. And recognize that while you're living your life out, day to day, doing the little things, God has a big plan for your life. One of the best ways to illustrate this upper story, lower story thing, I think, is the story we're going to talk about this morning. It comes from chapter 3 of the story. You have that with you, or chapter 37 of Genesis if you want to use your Bible. But first I want to connect some dots just to kind of get us caught up to speed on some of this. So last week, we talked about Abraham and how Abraham was called to leave his family and travel to a place where God would give him. And God took him to the land of Canaan and told us to be the land of his descendants. And then God tested Abraham's faith by asking him to sacrifice his son Abraham. And he was willing to do that, but God stopped him and gave him a lamb as a provision, as a substitute gift or sacrifice. The week before that, we talked about the creation and the flood. And then after the flood, we talked about Noah's family spreading out. And so here's a family tree of Noah going through Abraham. And I don't know if you can read all that, but there's some names on there that some of you might find familiar, and so I want to connect some of these dots. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. His son Ham disgraced his father, a little story you can read about back in Genesis 11 or 12. So Noah cursed his descendants. And so the descendants of Ham would serve the descendants of Shem and of Japheth. Well, among Ham's children were some sons. Their names were Cush. We don't know too much about him. Another one was named Egypt. And he became a nation of Egypt. All right, you're good. You got this. All right. Another son was named Canaan. And his descendants became the Canaanites, which is where Abraham went and lived in the land of Canaan. So he was living in the land occupied by the descendants of Ham. When we get to Joshua, later on, when we read the story about Joshua and the Israelites moving into the Promised Land, we're going to see that they had to conquer all the tribes that lived there. And there's the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. All of those were descendants of Ham. All right, so Ham was cursed. Your kids are going to be bad, and they became the ones that everybody else had to come in and drive out. All right? So now you know where those came from. Well, Abraham and eventually the Israelites were descendants of Shem. So I put a little dotted line there. There's probably about 9 or 10 generations through there actually from Shem to Abraham. So this could have been 300 to 400 years later when Abraham finally comes around. So 400 years of their descendants growing and multiplying, growing and multiplying. So there could have been thousands of them all over by that time. All right? Then Abraham's son Isaac grew up and married Rebekah. Now, to put this together, Abraham had two brothers, Haran and Nahor. And so his son Isaac married Rebekah, which was Abraham's brother Nahor's granddaughter. Did you catch that? All right, you kind of put that together? All right, so they're interrelated here, cousins, second cousins, whatever that would be. Isaac's son, Jacob, then marries the daughters of Laban. Well, Laban was Rebekah's brother. So Jacob is marrying his first cousins. See how that puts together? All right? So now you get some of these little things put together here. All right? Between the two wives and their handmaids, Jacob had 12 sons, and eventually Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So his sons are called the children of Israel, or the 12 tribes of Israel. All right? So all the Israelites came from Jacob and his 12 sons. Jacob's brother Esau had children. One of them was named Edom, and they became the Edomites. And sometimes as you read through your Bible, you're going to read about Edomites. Those are Esau's grandkids and descendants thereof. All right? Now remember, Abraham didn't just have Isaac, though. Before Isaac was born, he had a son named Ishmael. Ishmael had 12 sons, and they became a nation called the Ishmaelites. So if you ever read about the Ishmaelites, that was where that came from. After Sarah died, Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. And she had 6 sons at least. The fourth of that's named was Midian. And so Midian's descendants are called the Midianites. All right? Later, the Ishmaelites and the Midianites intermarried and basically melded into one group. And they're called the Midianites in most places, but in some places they're still referred to as the Ishmaelites. So the names Midianites and Ishmaelites become interchangeable. That's important to know because as you read through the story, chapter 3 of your story here, you'll read about the Midianites and you're going to read about the Ishmaelites, and it sounds like they're the same people, and it's really confusing until you realize that they are, in fact, the same people. All right? So when you read, it'll say the Ishmaelites came along and bought Joseph, and then the Midianites sold him. You go, wait a minute, Ishmaelites bought him and the Midianites sold him. That doesn't make any sense. Well, it does, because they're the same people. All right? Clear that up for you now before you get into reading all this stuff. So now you see where a lot of these tribes that they fought against were. And in fact, if you know about the Moabites and the Ammonites, those were the descendants of Haran through Lot. It was Abraham's nephew that he brought with him when he went into the promise. So you get all this stuff? All right, hopefully that'll help put some of that stuff together and connect some of those dots. All of these people that are fighting are all, if you go back to Noah, related. Now, big picture story. Here we are 4,000 years later, and we go to war and we fight against all kinds of countries all over the world. And guess what? If we go back to Noah, we're all related. So they may be distant 159th cousins, but somewhere along the line, we're all related to one another. All right, that's enough dots for now. Let's read chapter 3 of the story, chapter 37 of Genesis. Jacob has these 12 sons that we told you about at the beginning of the story. here there was only 11 of them alive. The 12th son, Benjamin, wasn't born yet. So this story takes place before Benjamin is born, and there's a long time between Joseph and Benjamin. Now, I can kind of relate to this because I have a brother that's 13 years younger than I am. But in our story, we're going to find out that Joseph was 17 years old and his brother hadn't been born yet. So there's like 20 years between Joseph and his brother. All right? It's a whole different generation. They didn't know each other at all. The 11th son, or the youngest at this point in the story, was Joseph. And we'll pick up the story when Joseph is 17. All of the brothers are shepherds. They tended flocks. And Joseph would come home and tell on his brothers. Hey, Dad, guess what they did today? Can you believe it? And so his brothers hated him because he always pulled on them. You got a sibling like that? Somebody always pull on you? Now, Jacob loved Joseph more than the other brothers because Joseph's mother was Rachel, and Rachel was his favorite wife/mother of his children. All right? And so Jacob gave Joseph an ornate robe, or what we call the coat of many colors. And of course, this made his brothers hate him even more. You're telling us all the time, and you're daddy's favorite. Then Joseph has a dream where he and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain, and suddenly his sheaf rose up, and the brothers' sheaves bowed down to his. Now here's a little lower story application for you. If you have a dream of your brothers bowing down to you, then you probably want to keep that dream to yourself. All right? But Joseph, of course, who liked to tell on his brothers and was his dad's favorite, thought this was a good thing to tell his brothers about, which made them furious. So one day the brothers had gone out to tend the flocks without Joseph, and Jacob sends Joseph out and says, why don't you go find out what they're doing and come back and tell me about it? Go tell on your brothers again. And so when the brothers see Joseph coming, they decide they're going to kill him. And then they're going to tell Jacob that a ferocious animal came and devoured him. Now, I don't know how many of you fight with your brothers and sisters. Little sibling rivalry there. I doubt that you have anything on these guys. This is the dysfunctional family through whom God is going to build a great nation. See, God can work with anyone. And you think, well, my family's messed up. My dysfunctional family, God can never use. Well, do you have a favorite son who wants to be killed by his brothers and then lied about that he was devoured by wild animals? And see, you're not that bad. God can use them to build a great nation. God can use your family. Well, the oldest brother, Reuben, doesn't want to kill Joseph, so he's trying to stop his brothers and says, well, how about we just throw him in a well? And I think, well, okay, we'll do that. So they throw him in the well. Reuben's thought was, I'll come back and rescue him later. Well, Reuben goes off and does his thing. All the other brothers sit down and eat. And as they're eating, a group of Ishmaelites or Midianites come riding by in their caravan, and they're going on their way to Egypt. And they decide they're going to sell Joseph to these Midianites or Ishmaelites on the way to Egypt. And so they sell Joseph. They take his robe, and they dip it in a goat's blood. They take him back to his dad and say he was devoured by a wild animal. Meanwhile, Reuben comes back to rescue him, and he's gone. So not all the brothers are in on this, but most of them were. Joseph was sold into slavery. The Midianites and Ishmaelites took him to Egypt, sold him to the captain of Pharaoh's guard. So a pretty highly esteemed man. His name is Potiphar. So on your side map there, if you have a map on the inside of your book, if you want to draw in there, you might just draw a little symbol for Joseph, or I wrote Joe in there, write a J, or draw a picture of Joseph. And you say he traveled from Jerusalem into Egypt because his brothers sold him into slavery, and he was carried into Egypt and sold there. All right? Now, while there, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. Potiphar recognized this, put Joseph in charge of his household, and his household then prospered. So we see God at work in Joseph's life. This might work out okay for him. Yeah, he was sold into slavery, but now he's the head of Potiphar's house. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. You guys don't have any problem imagining that. All right? Because of that, eventually Potiphar's wife took an interest in him and tried to seduce him several times. And every time he refused her advances. But one day, she caught him by the coat, and as he ran out, she pulled it off of him. So then she took the coat and showed it to her husband and said, "That slave kid is making, he tried to attack me." Well, that made Potiphar angry, and Joseph was put into prison. So it looked like God was working things out. And now all of a sudden he's back in prison. Now we don't see how God can possibly be at work. How could God allow this to happen to an innocent person? Joseph, minding his own business, telling on his brothers and bragging a little bit, but innocent, sort of, sold into slavery. Finally, God blesses him. He gets back to the top of Potiphar's house, and now he's back in prison again. How is it that God can allow him to be beat down and rise up and be beat back down? We'll get back to that. While in prison, Joseph correctly interprets some dreams with God's help. And a couple years later, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, has a dream that puzzled him, and none of his magicians could interpret it for him. So someone remembers Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. So Joseph is brought in to interpret the dream for Pharaoh. And here's how it goes in Genesis 41:15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." And Joseph's response is, "I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Joseph earlier, you remember, was telling his brothers how they were going to bow down to him and how he's going to be something great. And now in prison, he's given the ability to interpret dreams, and he's brought before the ruler of the land to interpret a dream, and he does not take credit for it. See, I think the old Joseph would have said, "Yeah, I can do that for you." But because he had been raised up and then beat down, and raised up and beat down, he was humble enough at this point to recognize, "No, I don't have any ability to know myself. The only reason I can interpret your dream is because God reveals it to me. It's God that is interpreting your dream." After 2 or 3 years in prison, we might think that God has forgotten us. But it's during that time that Joseph learned God was with him. Well, these dreams were a warning that there would be 7 years of abundant harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph recommended that the Pharaoh find a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of collecting food during the good years, so they'd have food saved up for the bad years that were coming up. And in Genesis 41, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. So you shall be in charge of my palace, and all of my people will submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Joseph goes from being in prison to being second in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Now, who would have thought that? Who else but God could have made that happen? You see, when God works a plan, God gets the glory. Because God does something so big that God has to be at work, and it won't work without God. That's why God chooses worth something, and God uses us. We'll take credit for it. But when we know we're worth nothing, and God uses us, He gets all the glory for it. We talked about this last week. Why did God choose Abraham and Sarah, an old couple that couldn't have kids, to become the parents of a great nation? Well, it's because when it happened, nobody gave them credit. Everybody knew God was at work. And when a lowly prisoner, forgotten in the dungeons, gets elevated to second in command in the whole land of Egypt, you know God's at work. And it happened just like God said. 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine didn't just hit Egypt. It hit all around Egypt too. So during the famine, people came to buy grain from Egypt. And of course, you know the theories of the supply and demand, the idea that because supply was so limited and demand was so high, the price went up. And so Egypt got really, really rich during this time. Well, the famine hit Canaan as well. So Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain. And in Genesis 42:6 we read, "Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground." Just like Joseph had dreamed all those years earlier. But they didn't recognize him. They didn't know it was him. Obviously, he's an Egyptian ruler now, so he's like 20 years older. He's about 38, 39 years old. And of course, as an Egyptian ruler, you wear a lot of makeup. Ugh. But, okay, it goes with the position. All right, so they didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized them and decides to toy with them a little bit. So he accuses them of being spies. And then he puts them in prison for 3 days. And then he finally sends them home and says they have to go get their younger brother and bring him back with them, or he'll never give them grain again. So then they bring Benjamin back, and then when they leave, Joseph hides his silver cup, his royal chalice, in Benjamin's sack, and sends them off. And then sends his guards to pursue him and to say that they stole his cup. And they're like, "No, we didn't steal your cup. If we did, well, whoever did will be your slave." And so they all open their sacks, and he finds the cup in Benjamin's sack. And so Benjamin has to be a slave. And now all the brothers are like, "Oh, no, not the other brother of Rachel too, or the other son of Rachel. We already gave up Joseph. Dad hadn't, and still hasn't recovered. And now we're taking away his youngest son, Benjamin." So they all throw themselves at the mercy of Joseph and, "Oh, take us as your prisoners instead." And finally, after they sweat it out a little bit, Joseph reveals himself. In Genesis 45, Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt." Now, how would you feel if you sold your brother into slavery, told your dad he died, and now you're standing before the second in command of all of Egypt, and find out that's your little brother? But he said to them, "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5, there will be no plowing or reaping. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." Joseph has a chance here to punish his brothers for all they've done, but he doesn't. Instead, he invites them to move to Egypt so that he can take care of them during the famine. Can you imagine Joseph being that merciful to his brothers who sold him? See, Joseph sees the big picture. Joseph sees that upper story. All they see is the lower story. We stole our brother, and now he can have us killed. But Joseph sees the upper story. If he hadn't sold me, we'd all be starving in Canaan right now. But God sent me ahead of you guys to prepare for this time, so that the Canaanite, the Israelites, and our family to be preserved. And not just by providing food. Yeah, moving to Egypt allowed them to have food, but it was even more than that. The move to Egypt preserved the purity of the line of Israel. See, the Israelites were shepherds. That's what they did. The Egyptians considered shepherding an abomination. And they would not marry their children to a shepherd. So there was no way the Egyptians and the Israelites were going to intermarry. The Egyptians wouldn't have it. But back in Canaan, some of the stories we skipped over, the Canaanites wanted to intermarry with the Israelites. And in fact, so much that they forced themselves on one of the daughters of Jacob. And there was a great battle there. But the Canaanites were willing to intermarry with the Israelites. Come live among us. Come join us. We'll marry your kids. You'll marry our kids. We'll be one big happy family. If they had done that, the Israelites would have been swallowed up into Canaan, the Canaanites. And it would have been just like how the Ishmaelites got swallowed up into the Midianites. And so now it's the Midianites / Ishmaelites. We could have the Israelites / Canaanites. Or the Canaanites / Israel. But because they moved to Egypt, their genetic lineage was preserved. You see, God takes the worst life throws at us and uses it to accomplish great things. He takes the worst that happened to Joseph, being sold into slavery, finally raising up and then thrown into prison, in order to make something good, preserve the house of Israel. Paul knew this, and he wrote this in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. See, when we see the upper story, we realize that God is at work, even in the most difficult circumstances we face. We're able to maintain hope. We're able to forgive those who sin against us. We're able to experience peace and joy in the midst of trials. So for those of us whose life isn't turning out quite like we envisioned it, we need to adopt this Romans 8:28 perspective. God works for the good of those who love Him. But notice this isn't for everyone. This is for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. In other words, for those who are called to follow Christ and have accepted Christ and are now being obedient to God, we have a promise that as we live in obedience to God, He will work everything for good. But if you've never entered into that personal relationship with Jesus, if you've never become a Christian, this promise is not for you. If you want that promise, you need to become a follower of Christ. If you are a Christian, but you're not living obediently to God, then this promise isn't for you. Instead of asking God to bless your plans, perhaps you need to align your plans with His, because He does not promise to bless your plan. He promises to bless those who are called according to His purpose, His plan. And if you're living in obedience to God, according to His plan, and yet life still isn't working out quite the way you expected, remind yourself that you're looking at the lower story. God's working on an upper story. He's got something bigger in mind than you do. And you're missing out on it because all you see is what's in front of you. So continue to live in obedience and trust God. He's working for something good. And someday it'll all make sense, but for now, not so much. But just have faith in Him now as you go through the tough times. See, God cannot use a person until they're broken or until they're humbled. As long as we're full of pride, God can't use us. As long as Joseph was full of pride and telling on his brothers and how he was better than them, God couldn't use him. He had to beat him down, throw him in prison twice. I've had to go through a lot of humbling in my life. That I didn't become the millionaire businessman I intended to be. But God has to do that in order to use us. Because as long as we're full of pride, we'll use His blessings for our glory. And He knows that, so He won't give us those blessings. We have to be humbled. We have to be broken. So when He gives us favor, or power, or authority, we won't use it for our own gain. We'll use it for His glory, for His honor, for His purposes. We won't take credit for it. We'll give glory to God. And then kind of like Joseph will be able to say, I cannot do it, but God will do it. Through me, but God's doing it. I'm just along for the ride. But it's a great ride. So as your pastor, let me ask you this. Are you in? Are you ready for that ride? Sure. God, this story does go all over the place, and it is such a cool reminder that you're at work. You're doing some incredible things that we can't imagine. So when life doesn't go the way we expect, and when we feel defeated and depressed and burnt out and broken, would you remind us that we're finally getting to a place where you can use us? Would you remind us that you have something bigger in store? And would you help us to trust you? And so if we're not a Christian because we're just not sure what Christians do and what the benefit is, we want us to realize that until we are, you have no plan for us. You have no blessings for us. And those of us who are Christians, but we're doing our own thing, would you help us, Father, to stop and to realize that doing our own thing is worthless. In the end, it'll all get burnt up and amount to nothing. Would you help us instead to work for your glory? And again, Father, if we're in that boat where we feel like we're doing the right thing and yet somehow it just doesn't work out and we start questioning whether we're doing it right, remind us what happened to Abraham when he tried to do it his way and all the mess that made. Would you help us to trust you and to not create our own plan and to just keep doing what you've asked us to do? And then, Father, would you help us to give you all the glory for it? Father, I realize that it's a bigger commitment than we even realize we're making, but would you allow us to commit ourselves to following you now? To recognize that whatever you desire, we're in. We're ready. Let's go. We pray in Christ's name.